First, a word to Mrs. Smith. I have a theory, a genetic theory on children, and all children have a recessive gene that does not allow them to hear their parents' voice until they're about 35. My sons are 29 and 31, and it's beginning to dawn on them that their father has something to say. Not very often, but I think that any parent understands that. I also want to start by just saying, as I do to my clients, the glass that we saw at lunch is not only empty, it's cracked, and it won't hold water. That kind of cynical view as a lawyer serves me well, so that if anything we succeed at, it's considered a victory. And so, again, my 31-year-old son says, "Oh, Dad, you're just too cynical." And I tell him that I have earned my cynicism. I've been an investigator for the federal government 3 different times. It was interesting, on the Intelligence Committee, I had to interview the mafia that had been hired by Kennedy to try to assassinate Castro. I interviewed Judith Exner, who was his mistress that he shared with Sam Giancana. Mr. Giancana got shot the night before I was to interview him, so I didn't get a chance to talk with him. And actually, this is a really good panel, because Rod is the person who is going to tell you the glass is not only half full, it's ascending, and I'm the one who's going to tell you it's a bit cracked. But I continue, so my wife, who's an oncology nurse, says that I still have some modicum of optimism. But I want to talk about politics. I got my start in politics by being elected 3rd grade class president at Dilworth Elementary School in Mrs. Sharp's class. And the biggest part of that was I got to clean out the goldfish tank. So that was a real honor that spurred me on to many other ventures in politics. I became the Democratic state chair, and we had our convention in the proverbial phone booth, which was in Salt Lake County, not in Utah County. And then in 1992, I ran for governor. The good citizens of Utah didn't recognize that they needed an Irish Catholic governor, so I was unsuccessful there. And then in 1994, Senator Hatch was running for his 3rd term, and nobody was going to run against him. And so, foolishly, as my wife would characterize it, I said I would run on the bus theory. He had to get hit by a bus before I could get elected. I wasn't wanting that to happen, and so we had 6 debates, which were very worthwhile. I want to go back. I've been thinking, I turned 69 in Dublin, Ireland in February. I was there to give a lecture on biology to Trinity College. And at that stage of my career, I needed to figure out what I wanted to do. So I've decided that I'm going to focus on 2 issues that may seem unrelated, but they're quite related. One is water. We are in a crisis that we don't recognize yet about water. And the other is children. Children really are the hope for the future. And when I was a freshman at Stanford, I participated in the Head Start program. So I'd ride my bike over to East Palo Alto, and I wanted to do an experiment with kids. So I had a piece of blank paper and crayons, and I'd tell these children, ages 3 to 8, to draw me a picture with the crayon, and then they would tell me a story of what that picture represented, and I'd record it on a tape recorder. And what I found, not surprisingly, is the younger they were, they used the intonation of their voice to express very complicated ideas. They didn't have the vocabulary. Most of them came from deprived backgrounds or single-family homes, but their ability to express their ideas was controlled by their voice. And yet, unfortunately, as they got older, age 6, 7, and 8, that wonderful richness of intonation became more of a monotone, because the powers of conditioning amongst their teachers and their schools, and indeed their churches, were making them into how they thought they wanted to behave. Now, I raise that because you can take any group of children anywhere in the world, and as long as they're 4 or 5 years old, those children inherently know what is fair. If something happens to a group of students when they're in the playground, and you ask them, that just happened, was that fair? They will almost be unanimous in their judgment about what was fair. And it seems to me that somehow we need to begin to think more seriously about how that altruism of how fairness is an inherent part of us as Homo sapiens should and could continue into other institutions. And I would suggest that these kind of conferences are very important, but what we are failing to do is to focus on how we educate our children for future generations. And if you think religion is a divisive issue, go to your local school board and suggest that there be some change in curriculum. The public education started in the 19th century, as an earlier speaker recognized. And yes, I think it was spurred by the enormous wave of immigrants and the recognition that we needed to have some uniformity of language, some uniformity of mathematics. But in the latter part of the 20th century, in a post-World War period, I think we all became so specialized that we did not have the ability to reach out and communicate across the lines of our specialization. And that certainly happened in politics. Politics, in my judgment, has deteriorated where the motivation of fear and divisiveness has become the norm rather than the exception. When I was in 6th grade, President John Kennedy came to Utah, and I was one of 2 people in my 6th grade, Mrs. Kelly's class, that had supported John Kennedy. Everybody else was for Richard Nixon. So my parents let me go downtown to the Tabernacle, and the Secret Service actually let me into the building to see President Kennedy. Could you imagine that happening in 2017? Absolutely not. But I was inspired by the aspirational aspect of his view of politics. And to hear Martin Luther King's speech on the Mall, again, was an aspirational aspect to politics. We can make a difference. Now compare that to the rhetoric of 2016, where there was divisiveness on all sides of politics. It wasn't just left to Donald Trump. There were parts of Hillary Clinton's campaign who were trying to galvanize the people on her side. And Rod, that's where I get a bit concerned, because politics is the art of compromise, and religion can't compromise on its principles. So the idea of the strong wall separating church from state, I think in the 21st century, with this incredible thing called the internet that permeates everything, we need to think of a way in which there can be accommodations to religion, because I certainly don't, I agree with you about the important role that religious thought has had with our political leaders in the past. But I think because Senator Church, who I worked for 3 different times, after he was defeated in the 1980 election, had dinner with Debbie and I in Salt Lake. And he said, you know, the thing that's interesting to me about politics in the West is that over the last 20 or 15 years, the right wing, as he referred to it, has been able to string together a necklace of fear. There was the fear about your guns. There was the fear about homosexuals. There was the fear about our public schools. There was the fear about abortion. So we've moved from a society that saw reaching out to everybody, regardless of their past, to a drawing up the drawbridge and saying we're going to build this wall around those who are part of it. And to me, the challenge in the 21st century is we have to reestablish that sense of community. The Greeks and the idea of the polis is something that needs to be reviewed and renewed. And that is, the polis was the place where citizens, and admittedly not everyone was a citizen, and they did have slaves, would gather in an open manner and decide how that polis would decide decisions of important policy. And it seems to me one of the paradoxes of our time is we have this amazing ability to communicate in this sea of information, and yet we seem unable to communicate. So just yesterday, I was having conversations with somebody in Beijing, and then I was having at the same time, or not the same time, a half an hour later, conversations with people in Ireland. And the ability to have that kind of communication is absolutely essential. And I almost thought today, as we were sitting at that lunch with those beautiful stained glass windows, that there needs to be another panel that would go on. And that other panel would show an incredible merging together of a secular society that was driven by principles that could be honored by each of the cultures, that did not divide us along those lines, but united in the common celebration of what we aspire to. Now, I have to go back to government. My time in government, one principle stood out amongst all others, and that is, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Because a good crisis is the only time you can break down bureaucratic lines and say, all right, we're going to do this, and the reason we're going to do it is that there's a crisis. There's a flood, there's a hurricane, we don't have a budget, all sorts of different things. And so maybe the thing we need to train our students to do is to think of how to react in that crisis. And to me, that's where rhetoric, the use of logic, and the use of our sense of fairness that we have as small children, and that some are able to retain as they mature into adulthood, is the touchstone that we need to have. So one last thought, and I would say this with respect, though, in the last 20 years, that God has provided a cover, political cover, for scoundrels. And so we need to have the ability to identify those scoundrels and make sure that they're held accountable. And I think that's one of the things that's happened on both sides, left and right, is that when there is misbehavior or there's unethical conduct, I don't care whether it's left or the right, there needs to be a calling out and punishment that goes with that misbehavior. And I don't think either side sees that, because they see themselves united as an army seeking out their truth as opposed to the other side's truth. So the accommodations we need to make, in my judgment, require a discipline to ethics and to achieving an aspirational goal. And with that, I look forward to questions.